good afternoon, or perhaps early evening, depending on how you think of it, everybody. If you have been studying at your book school today, I hope your first day was mind-blowing. And if you are a member of the local community, you are most cordially welcome. My name is Michael Suarez. I'm the director of our book school, and it's my great pleasure to introduce our speaker for this, the first of our summer lecture series. Our lecture today is an NEH-SHARP sponsored Living American History in Primary Documents lecture, and we're very grateful for that sponsorship from two august organizations, the National Endowment for the Humanities and SHARP as well. S. Max Edelson, a scholar of the history of early modern colonialization and the history of cartography, is professor of history and associate chair of the Corcoran Department of History here at the University of Virginia. He studied at Cornell University and at the University of Oxford before receiving his doctorate from Johns Hopkins University in 1999. His first book, Plantation Enterprise, in colonial South Carolina from Harvard University Press, describes how planters and slaves adapted to the volatile environments of the Carolina Lowcountry. Plantation Enterprise was awarded the George C. Rogers Prize by the South Carolina Historical Society and the Theodore Salutos Memorial Award by the Agricultural History Society. You know an academic monograph did well when Harvard University Press issued it as a paperback 5 years after it was published in hardback. His second book, The New Map of Empire, How Britain Imagined America Before Independence, Harvard University Press, 2017, examines British attempts to reform American empire through surveying and cartography in the generation before the American Revolution. The New Map of Empire features a free companion website with a digital archive of more than 250 maps, I think there are 257 to be exact, and charts discussed in the book. It was a finalist for the George Washington Book Prize in 2017 and received the John Langman Book Award for U.S. Maritime History by the North American Society for Oceanic History. Professor Edelman co-directs two digital projects, Map Scholar and Visual Eyes, both platforms for geospatial visualization in the humanities. He also co-directs the UVA Early American Seminar at Monticello, a research community for faculty and graduate students in Charlottesville. We are delighted to have him among our number this evening. Please join me in welcoming Professor Edelson.
Well, thank you for coming out here. I want to thank Michael and all the team here at Weir Book School, who's done such a good job promoting this event and getting it together. And thanks to all of you for coming. I was once myself a Weir Book School student. When I started teaching the history of cartography, I took the cartography Weir Book School at the Library of Congress with John Hessler, and that really got my lecture course that I teach here regularly going. I'm also appreciative for the hard work the team here did in promoting this talk. Some of you may have been drawn to it by this tweet, which featured one of the maps I'll be talking about this evening, as well as a picture of me. And if you don't know what those little buttons are at the bottom that say, oh, these are something that those of us who work in digital humanities use all the time to provide guidance for images for visually impaired readers. And I was charmed and I genuinely felt seen when I clicked the little Alt button next to my picture and read that I'm a smiling white man with beard and glasses standing in front of a wall with maps. I don't think anyone's ever captured my essence so purely as that tweet. So tonight I will be a mostly smiling white man with beard and glasses standing in front of two screens with maps, and I hope you like looking at them and enjoy what I have to say about them. Lately, I've been exploring two notable map collections that focus on colonial America during the 7 Years' War and the American Revolution. In November, I joined a remarkable group of scholars at Mount Vernon at the 2022 George Washington Symposium. Together, we admired and discussed the new Richard H. Brown Revolutionary War map collection. In Charlottesville, I spent the last year and a half working with the Seymour I. Schwartz collection of North American maps, another recent gift that has brought a trove of hundreds of maps and rare books to UVA, and that has become the focus of my teaching with undergraduates and graduate students. In this lecture, I'd like to give you a key to understanding what makes so many of these maps at the end of the colonial period so compelling. They reflect what I'm calling the surveyor's eye. The surveyor's eye saw geography from a military perspective. It sought to reveal strategic spaces in high resolution. It zoomed in on visible features of terrain to reveal strategic spaces, to reveal the human scale of engagement with the landscape. Its images are marked by crisp lines and topographic relief that seem tailor-made to tell stories about war. With such maps, one can narrate the progress of troops across a detailed geography. This evening, I'd like to show how maps from this era reveal the influences of military surveying, a tradition that shaped the look of 18th century maps and the ways in which map viewers engaged with early America as a place. Across a century of imperial warfare, the surveyor's eye changed the image of America in the British Atlantic world. Sanger and Bennett's The Seat of War in New England was an image that pictured troops in motion across the highways of Massachusetts in June 1775, converging on Roxbury, Cambridge, Charlestown, and the occupied port of Boston. It emerged from a copperplate press in London in September, just a few months after the events it depicts. But some 2 decades before Lexington, Concord, and Bunker Hill, cartography had already shifted to favor the military surveyor's eye. From the mid-1750s, the British mapping of America increased dramatically. These maps were different from those that came before. They rendered coastlines with precision derived from rigorous on-site observation. They populated flat paper landscapes with shading that brought cliffs and hillsides into 3 dimensions. And they magnified the human geography of colonial settlement, revealing the outlines of cultivated fields and even the footprints of buildings. In short, British military and imperial surveyors recreated early America as a world that you could see as if you were there. Officials planning colonies and campaigns from London used these maps to visualize distant frontiers. And those who might never leave the comfort of their libraries in England traveled in their imaginations to these remote places on which the fate of the British Empire depended. Britain sent teams of surveyors along with military forces to North America and the West Indies in the 1750s, 60s, and 70s. These mapmakers produced a remarkable surge of new maps, plans, and charts. Before these great wars for American empire, Britain's mapping of America was episodic, uneven, and infrequent. When Charles II created the Council on Trade and Plantations in 1672, the king charged the Lords of Trade to, in his words, procure exact maps, plats, or charts of all and every of our said plantations abroad. The Lords of Trade began by acquiring maps produced by others to illustrate Britain's far-flung places. from Newfoundland to Barbados and beyond. Some of the maps were original manuscripts that codified the working knowledge of long-distance navigators. Others were well-regarded publications produced on copperplate printing presses in London, Amsterdam, Paris, and Frankfurt. England's first official map archive was derivative. It did not involve the state in making its own maps as a regular and organized activity. The Board of Trade sent questionnaires to the colonies, asking for new maps to show boundaries, populations, strategic regions. Sometimes colonial governors complied with these requests, providing additional maps alongside written reports. Long before Britain employed cartography as a tool of empire, its great rivals, Spain and France, had created active cartographic services that mapped American places. Throughout the colonial period, British authorities relied on commercial mapmakers to disseminate official and unofficial images of British America to broad audiences. The arrival of trained Army and Admiralty surveyors in America during the 1750s and 1760s brought a new capacity for mapmaking to North America and the West Indies. During the 7 Years' War, known as the French and Indian War in America, Great Britain jump-started a mini cartographic revolution. Colonial governors drew on the expertise of these military surveyors to illustrate their reports to Whitehall. But the real growth in the number of maps dispatched from America to Britain took place after the Treaty of Paris in 1763, when the British state began undertaking its own systematic surveys of its American possessions after the war. More surveyors arrived during the American Revolution, making maps that planned campaigns and documented battles. As the 7 Years' War began, a series of important regional maps of British and North America appeared in print that drew from these military surveys. These maps brought together deepening knowledge of the Atlantic coast, where growing colonial populations laid claim to an expanding zone of settlement. These new maps linked this knowledge of well-settled places with new information from surveying expeditions into the interior. John Green's new map of Nova Scotia made an aggressive assertion of British sovereignty over the contested lands of the maritime Northeast in 1755. As British and French commissioners wrangled over where British Nova Scotia ended and French Acadia began, this map argued for the continuity of British land claims from the Atlantic coast all the way to the St. Lawrence River. Green's map of the inhabited part of New England, also from 1755, makes another claim of British power, this time based on the region's surging populations and its imposition of civil order. Although the topography of New England's landscape is sketched lightly across this map's surface, its civil geography imposed a dense matrix of provincial, county, and township boundaries across the region. Lewis Evans' general map of the Middle Colonies connected new knowledge of the continent to long-established jurisdictions closer to the coast. Evans' own participation in a 1749 diplomatic mission to Iroquois country added new specificity to a map that reached deep into the interior. Such a map was a prospectus for future colonization. It helped Britons at home and abroad imagine mainland colonies as empires in miniature, poised to expand into a vast continental frontier. Joshua Fry and Peter Jefferson pictured Virginia in similar ways in a map first published in 1753. They brought together the knowledge they had accumulated as boundary surveyors and land speculators to reveal new western landscapes. The map's cartouche celebrated Virginia's signature staple commodity, tobacco, and made no attempt to conceal how British America's most populous colony depended on African slavery for its wealth. Yet the map's innovation was not its representation of the Chesapeake Bay or its connection to the Atlantic economy. Here, the interior appears for the first time less as a stylized jumble of mountains and more as a place that could be claimed and colonized. Coherent ridges separate lush river valleys, already named and enclosed by provincial boundaries, ready for settler occupation. To the south, surveyor William de Braun produced a masterpiece in 1757. His map of South Carolina and part of Georgia charted the expanding plantation landscape of the coastal lowcountry with startling new precision. De Braun geo-referenced the property boundaries maps his office had surveyed to make grants of land along the Combahee, Coosawhatchee, and Savannah rivers. Enslaved Africans remade these fertile swamplands into productive fields that generated record harvests of rice, South Carolina's staple export commodity. The map's cartouche pictured enslaved indigo makers beating and cutting indigo dye, which was fast becoming a second lucrative export from the colony. A finely detailed network of rivers reached from this repressive, productive coastal plain into the Carolina backcountry, where new townships were surveyed to anchor new settlements. This picture of the Southeast suggests that this landscape of plantations created in the coastal zone would expand, spreading slavery, plantations, and profits along new riversides into the future. This map held out the prospect that these blank spaces in the interior would become, someday, as densely inscribed as the plantation coast. Together, these regional maps showcased the history of British colonization in North America. They brought together official records of landholding, boundaries, and civil jurisdictions with knowledge gained from new exploratory journeys. Together, they staked a strong British claim to possession and articulated a desire for territorial expansion. By the middle decades of the 18th century, British North America was no longer a collection of separate colonies. Instead, it appeared on these regional maps, all published in the mid-1750s, as a continental empire, one that was deeply entrenched and poised for expansion. The most celebrated American map of the century was produced during this fruitful decade for colonial cartography, John Mitchell's A Map of the British and French Dominions in North America. This map stitched together these regional views of British North America into a continental vision of empire. Mitchell's map projected bold British claims to sovereignty over virtually all of eastern North America. The head of Britain's Board of Trade at the time, the Earl of Halifax, personally recruited John Mitchell to undertake this map, gave him access to Britain's archives of manuscript map images, and when these proved inadequate, commanded colonial governors to draft new maps of their provinces so that John Mitchell could compile a state-of-the-art synthesis. Mitchell's map is a fantasy of dominion. Its charter boundary lines cross territories still inhabited and controlled by Native Americans. It anticipated the rapid reproduction of American settler populations that would soon extend these jurisdictions to the west. Bolstered by the credibility that came with compiling and synthesizing the manuscript record of settlement, this map pictured a mainland empire reaching across North America. These maps of America, published as the 7 Years' War began, illustrate Britain's imperial ambitions, but also reveal the limits of its geographic knowledge. When they arrived to challenge France in North America, British officers realized that the maps they had were simply too vague to guide the deployment of troops in the field. In institutional terms, the British military lagged its rivals on the continent in the practice of high-resolution military mapping. It was just beginning to develop standards, practices, and personnel needed to create truly useful military maps. A clear British vision for military mapping was forged by General William Roy in Scotland in the 1740s. Charged to create new military-grade maps of the rebellious Scottish Highlands, Roy applied the most sophisticated methods for topographic mapping to this strategic challenge. Because a commander never knew where his forces might have to be moved across the landscape to quash an uprising or pursue guerrilla fighters, ideal military maps pictured every topographic detail of a contested territory. With such maps at hand, a commander could move troops to any place at any moment. The maps Roy created in Scotland set a new standard for high-resolution topographic mapping. Georg Ludwig learned the art and science of military mapping as a lieutenant in the army of the Duchy of Saxe in Germany. He moved to Paris, where young Lieutenant Ludwig changed his name to Georges-Louis Le Rouge, and by 1740 became one of France's most prolific map publishers. This map documents a strategically important place with a bloody history. The Isthmus of Chignecto was one of the most contested places in the Atlantic world. The French insisted that it mark the boundary between Acadia and Nova Scotia. The British disagreed. After years of attacks and counterattacks, a fleet of British warships and transports disgorged over 2,000 troops to decide this issue in 1755. They captured Fort Beausejour and drove the French out, a critical early victory in the contest over Canada during the 7 Years' War. Le Rouge's map acknowledges this victory by noting the new British name for the captured fort, Fort Cumberland. This image features the key elements of military topographic mapping. It is a picture of the landscape divided into riverside lowlands and wooded highlands, cultivated fields and swampy pastures. The dikes and irrigation channels for which Acadian farmers were famous create landmarks that show this landscape at human scale. Shading with pastures pictures the hilly terrain of this peninsula. The careful delineation of rivers and roadways show how troops might cross this territory and where it remained impassable. Ideal military surveys pictured the terrain at a scale of 1 to 2 inches to the mile, a resolution that revealed details such as buildings, gardens, and fence lines. Instructors at the Royal Military Academy at Woolwich and the Royal Naval Academy at Portsmouth were beginning to teach budding engineers and surveyors how to make maps and charts to this exacting new standard. British regiments also became a magnet for skilled engineers from the continent, with more advanced survey and mapping traditions. We can find many non-English or anglicized names among the creators and contributors to many Revolutionary era maps, including Samuel Holland, William Brom, Charles Blaskowitz, Claude Joseph Sampierre, and J.F.W. DeBaer. These names reflect this migration of European mapping talent to the British military in this era. Military surveyors arrived in America to fight the 7 Years' War with pens, paper, and compasses. They planned routes through the woods, designed fortifications, and recorded the results of battlefield engagements. Their high-resolution manuscript maps reported the progress of the war to authorities in Britain. After the forts were built, battles won or lost, officials shared these hand-drawn maps with commercial publishers, especially the prolific Thomas Jeffreys. Jeffreys was among the first London map publishers who used his official title, geographer to the king, to obtain manuscript maps from the battlefield. He engraved their images on copper plates and printed them for public consumption. In 1768, Jeffreys and his fellow publisher Robert Sayer released a massive atlas that compiled American maps, many of which were created as military instruments during the 7 Years' War. This atlas, the General Topography of North America and the West Indies, tells the story of Britain's triumph over France. This overstuffed atlas of American places invited Britons to revisit the military victories celebrated in 1763. The General Topography dazzles the eye with the immensity of new territory that had been acquired at such a high cost of blood and treasure. This index map shows the coverage of the atlas's 93 maps, plans, and charts. At the broadest scale were general maps, like John Green's chart of the Atlantic Ocean with the British, French, and Spanish settlements in North America and the West Indies. From this place at the center of the New World, British sea power was positioned to take command of the whole. If we remove these grand hemispheric maps from the index, we can see the outlines of the important medium-scale maps of British America that demonstrate command over North American regions and Caribbean islands. Remove these, and what remains are the military maps that surveyors created during the war to fortify strategic sites and stage attacks by land and sea. The General Topography was a patriotic celebration of Great Britain's great victory in America, but it did not paste over some of the nation's most devastating defeats. The humbling opening chapter of the war began with General Edward Braddock's doomed march into the Pennsylvania backcountry to evict the French from Fort Duquesne at the forks of the Ohio River. The tale of Braddock's catastrophic advance begins by showing the arrangement of the general's famous flying column of 1,300 men arrayed along the road they had carved through the forest in 1755. On July 9th, French and native forces routed Braddock's troops, leaving Braddock dead and most of his officers and men dead or wounded. We don't know much about Robert Orme's training as a surveyor. We do know that this 30-year-old British Army lieutenant served as one of Braddock's aides de camp and created an indelible record of this painful defeat. His plans create a powerful illusion for the viewer who turn the pages of Jeffrey's general topography. From the scouts and cavalry officers in the vanguard at the front of this long line to the baggage carts at the back, these images position us as viewers hovering above the action. And yet a closer look shows that these trees aren't real. They're just a stylized pattern representing woodlands. We don't see humans, wagons, horses, or artillery pieces, but rather unit symbols in perfect alignment along this straight, clear path through the woods. When combined with other maps, they tell a coherent spatial story of defeat. On Orm's plan of the field of battle and disposition of the troops as they were on the march at the time of the attack, we zoom out from the high-resolution picture of Braddock's road to take in his objective, Fort Duquesne. We see the troops approaching, frozen in time, just before the bullets flew, as the title puts it, as they were on the march at the time of the attack. Orm's use of shading reveals the topographic relief that military surveyors were trained to show. Britain had hoped to drive France from its frontier stronghold, but instead suffered a grave defeat at the Battle of Monongahela. Orm and Jeffreys retold this national tragedy in a series of nested images at multiple scales of representation. Such images, once engraved, arranged, titled, annotated, and presented, along with other maps in this atlas, immersed British readers within a remote and vital American place. Robert Orm created these images to help plan Braddock's march. He revised them to create a patriotic record of a notorious military defeat for British audiences. He even drafted a manuscript journal of the events, although this account was never published during his lifetime. Orm set out to do what many trained military engineers did during the 18th century, to use their skills to make money and gain renown in the hopes of promotion. Trained mapmakers knew they could use their skills to advance their careers, and Robert Orm was definitely the man in the make. In addition to producing the maps that Jeffreys published in the General Topography, Joshua Reynolds painted his portrait. It shows Orm in his uniform as a member of Braddock's Coldstream Guards. This image helped him capitalize on his celebrity as a survivor of this famous battle. We see Orm here as a tragic heroic figure, full of swag and confidence. Although of humble social rank, this picture emphasized Orm as a man of skill and sensibility, a modern officer, whose talents promised to advance him to wealth and renown. Orm resigned his army commission in 1756. And then he eloped with Audrey Townsend, the volatile daughter of Charles Townsend, a senior British official who would play a crucial role in the coming of the American Revolution. As Orm recognized, high-resolution military maps were valuable because they allowed commanders to see contested territories from within the landscape. This quality also made such maps highly compelling to audiences who wanted to experience the distant places on which so much depended for themselves. The war now kindled in America, wrote Samuel Johnson in 1756, has incited us to survey and delineate the immense wastes of the Western continent by stronger motives than mere science or curiosity could ever have supplied. End quote. Britons pored over images of remote American places during and after the 7 Years' War. British armchair generals read published accounts of battles and located the scenes of action on newly published maps. These, in Johnson's words, enabled the imagination to wander over the lakes and mountains, to visualize a grand and expansive New World empire. From 1758, Britons read yearly summaries of the progress of the 7 Years' War in Edmund Burke's History of the Present War, a recurring essay published in the Annual Register. They bought newly published maps to see the places that Burke described. Not every reader could afford the 6 guineas it cost to purchase the General Topography of North America when it came out in 1768. And according to the currency converter of the UK National Archives, 6 guineas would now be worth about 550 pounds sterling, about $700, or the value of 1 cow, or 61 days of work by a skilled tradesman. So a pretty considerable investment. You had to have the resources and the willingness to buy a work like this.
Question, what is it worth now?
A lot more. But many more could afford individual sheet maps and cheaper collections. From 1763, they could inspect the 30 fort plans reduced from actual surveys, published in John and Marianne Rogue's A Set of Plans and forts in America. Like Jeffreys, John Rope used his connections to British officials to get access to original military manuscripts so that he could engrave them for printing. Britain did not have a state map publishing office, and senior officials approved the release of military manuscript maps in print. These precisely rendered images demonstrated British mastery over distant places to British, French, and other audiences. They also encouraged readers at home and abroad to engage in patriotic reflection about the costs and benefits of imperial warfare. In 1769, John Knox explained the purpose of his new book, An Historical Journey of the Campaigns in North America. He hoped to, quote, afford the most sublime of all entertainments to the generous mind, by placing before him past scenes of glory, in which he has either shared personally as military officers, or shall share in review by patriotic sympathy. In other words, those who bought his book and looked at its maps could engage in a patriotic moment in a way that was highly visual and highly emotional. Those who paid to subscribe to the book ahead of time saw their names printed in the copies they received when it was published. Here, between the covers of Knox's account of the military campaigns of the 7 Years' War, they joined aristocrats who had commanded troops in the field as patrons of this massive summer. When they opened these books, they could experience these scenes of British glory and defeat vicariously. Such texts and maps gave British readers and viewers a way to participate from their armchairs and with their eyes and imaginations in the story of empire as a collective national enterprise. For more than a decade after the peace of 1763, audiences clamored for maps and accounts of the 7 Years' War. As we have seen, George Louis Le Rouge published his map of Chignecto in Paris in 1755. In that same year, Thomas Jeffreys obtained a copy of this French map and re-engraved his own version of it, complete with new annotations and an English title, a large and particular plan of Chignecto Bay and the circumjacent country with the forts and settlements of the French, till dispossessed by the English in June 1755. Jeffreys included this copied map in his General Topography in 1768. His version of Le Rouge's map retained the finely rendered coastlines, soundings, the carefully engraved presentation of topographic relief in this landscape of fields, hills, and meandering rivers. Jeffreys also added in tiny engraved script a written narrative of the events of the battle. This was an invitation to viewers to read the narrative and trace their fingers along the surface of this map to locate the places it described. Jeffreys describes in this narrative how a force of 2,400 men under the command of Colonel Monckton arrived at the British Fort St. Lawrence on June 1st, 1755. This force crossed the river Missaquash, where British troops took fire from a French blockhouse. The superior British force overwhelmed this French outpost, which the French put to the torch as they retreated to Fort Beausejour. The British followed. They set up their cannon and began firing on Fort Beausejour on the 13th. By the 16th, the French had capitulated. On the 17th, Colonel Scott took possession of the fort, hoisted the English flag, and renamed it Fort Cumberland in honor of the Duke of Cumberland, the younger son of George II, and one of Britain's chief war commanders. The rest of Jeffreys' text summarizes the aftermath of the battle, the ordnance that was captured, the soldiers and civilians taken prisoner, and the numbers of dead and wounded. Jeffreys' narrative tells the story of the unfortunate Ensign Hay, who was captured by Indians and taken to the French fort. There, while eating breakfast with his French captors, he died along with 3 French officers, casualties of a well-aimed British cannonball. As the fort fell, the French lost 8 officers and 51 soldiers. 3 Mi'kmaq Indians allied with the French also died in the attack, including their sachem. When Thomas Manton published his History of the Late War in North America and the Islands of the West Indies in 1772, this map was the first of more than a dozen military maps and charts that folded all of the volume to illustrate its many battle narratives. Manton offered a detailed 5-page narrative of this battle that told the story of the successful British campaign to take Fort Beausejour and force the French evacuation. This image began as a French military manuscript. As a published image, it enabled the French and then the English to take stock of the events in this remote corner of the North American Northeast as the Seven Years' War began. And years later, it resurfaced again to illustrate a definitive historical account that encouraged British readers to relive these events. Such maps help readers imagine this remote place and what it looked like to the troops who passed through it. At its most granular, this map described the experiences of war at the scale of the human body. Among the casualties for the British was one Major Preble, who in Jeffrey's narrative described it. He received a slight wound in the shoulder, and Ensign Tom was wounded in the thigh. Military maps began as instruments of war, but they had a prominent afterlife as published maps that allowed British readers to experience the war for themselves in a way that was visceral, sensory, and compelling. At the end of the 7 Years' War, Britain's most experienced military surveyors remained in America to undertake new surveys of acquired territory. Samuel Holland, a trained Dutch surveyor, came to British North America as an officer in the Royal American Regiment. His surveys aided in the capture of the French fort at Louisbourg in 1758. He taught Admiralty surveyor James Cook how to conduct plane table coastal surveys, skills that Cook would apply during his famous voyages in the South Pacific. Together, Holland and Cook drafted new charts of the St. Lawrence River that proved vital to the successful British conquest of Quebec in 1759. Holland joined other surveyors to create a new, high-resolution map of occupied Canada. This performance earned him the attention of the Board of Trade. In 1764, they appointed him Surveyor General for the Northern District of their new General Survey of North America. His first task was to survey the island of St. John in the Gulf of St. Lawrence to the same exacting standards. Now called Prince Edward Island, the island of St. John was an early focal point for the Board of Trade's program of planned colonization in America. If Britain could populate this island with colonists, the plan went, they could secure this region from any future attempts by France to reclaim it. By inhabiting St. John, they could implant British power permanently at the point of entry to British Canada. They charged Samuel Holland to survey this island, assess its suitability for agriculture and fishing and lumbering, and divide it into massive 20,000-acre townships. In 1767, these townships were awarded by ballot to petitioners who promised to develop each of them into a prosperous place of settlement. This published map proclaimed to the world that Britain was determined to defend its new frontiers with aggressive schemes of colonization. Far to the south, in the Gulf of Mexico, the Admiralty ordered Captain George Galt to survey the Gulf Coast, now claimed as part of the new British colonies of East and West Florida. Galt's survey of Pensacola established safe navigation into this sheltered harbor, ideally situated to project British sea power into the Gulf of Mexico and serve as a base for intensifying trade with Spanish America. Like many maps and charts created to secure Britain's new territories after 1763, this one was engraved for publication in J.F.W. de Beer's Atlantic Neptune Atlas. Beyond the precise new picture of the coastline, Galt's maps sketched in the topography of the interior. As in the island of St. John, British officials granted townships and other land grants to prospective colonists, hoping to secure this new acquisition by encouraging its occupation by settlers. From 1764 to 1771, William de Brom charted the coast of peninsular Florida for the Board of Trade. As the Surveyor General for the Southern District, his task was to survey Florida's Atlantic coast and identify river inlets that might make good sites for new plantation settlements. De Brom's survey of the St. John's River around St. Augustine sparked a land boom that drew speculators to claim tracts of Florida land, the first of many overheated real estate schemes for which the Sunshine State has become notorious. His new surveys of the Florida Keys were the first to establish safe channels of navigation into this notoriously dangerous area for shipping. This German version of one of his charts synthesizes George Galt's surveys of the coast with de Brom's charts of the Atlantic coast and the Keys. Together, they helped Britain lay claim to new colonies with authoritative geographic knowledge. In the Caribbean, the Treaty of Paris ceded Dominica, St. Vincent, Grenada, and Tobago to Great Britain. The British plan for these islands was to rapidly develop them as new centers for African slavery and sugar production. The Ceded Island Land Commission sent surveyors to each of these islands to create comprehensive property maps. These divided every acre fit for cultivation into a numbered tract. These tracts were auctioned off to the highest bidder in London in the 1760s. In 1776, Chief Surveyor John Byers published a series of maps of the Ceded Islands. Drawn at the high-resolution scale of a half mile to the inch, these maps divided tropical islands into mountainous interiors and arable, farmable coastal plains ripe for sugar. They demonstrated, tract by tract, how Great Britain claimed and profited from these new sugar colonies. A couple of years after these Ceded Island maps appeared in print in London, Georges Louis LaRouche incorporated them into a new collection of 13 Caribbean maps, published in Paris. Just as Thomas Jefferson copied LaRouche's map of Chignecto in 1755, LaRouche returned the favor, creating new versions of Byers and Jeffrey's maps, publishing them in Paris in 1778. Although these maps originated to advance Britain's strategic and political aims of empire, in LaRouche's hands, they became tantalizing new images for French audiences. These new high-resolution maps of the Caribbean enabled French map viewers to reach across the ocean in their imaginations and picture these exotic, brutal, and productive places over which their rival empires contended. British surveyors spent the 1760s and 1770s mapping territories in America in the hopes of defending, populating, and enriching a vast Atlantic empire. But when the rupture of the American War of Independence broke out, new military views of coastlines, islands, and interiors mobilized this new knowledge for a very different purpose, to make war on America. Charles Blaskowitz served as an assistant surveyor to Samuel Holland and worked on the General Survey of North America. In 1764, he arrived on the coast of Rhode Island to chart it for the survey. A decade later, on the eve of the Revolution, he returned with a new survey to perfect the chart's plan of Newport. He undertook to map the countryside around Rhode Island at the invitation of the colony's principal farmers, whom he listed by name in the published chart. Below this acknowledgement of the local gentry who funded the project, Blaskowitz sang Rhode Island's praises. He noted its history of religious toleration, its delightful summers, and its many advantages for commerce, husbandry, and agriculture. But before Blaskowitz could publish his chart, the Revolutionary War disrupted this narrative of ongoing colonial development. On December 6, 1776, following years of violent resistance to customs officials in Rhode Island, British Major General Sir Henry Clinton sent an expeditionary force that invaded Newport. Clinton used a manuscript copy of Blaskowitz's chart to organize the town's occupation by 7,000 British soldiers. When William Faded published it in 1778, he dedicated the chart to Hugh, Earl Percy, the commander Clinton left behind to defend the town. New annotations located the works and batteries raised by the Americans in their failed stand against this assault. These and other images of revolutionary engagement appeared in Faded's new compilation of American maps called the North American Atlas. It is one of many examples in revolutionary map collections that show the abrupt shift of imperial mapping in the late 1770s. Britain's new maps of empire, created to develop the empire through new colonization, were quickly repurposed to enable British forces to conquer rebellious American colonies. In the second half of the 18th century, British surveyors came to North America and the West Indies in unprecedented numbers. Their images of coastlines, forts, and frontiers helped win the war with France and pictured a triumphant British Atlantic world. The American Revolution shattered this vision of peace, commerce, and settlement. Once tasked to promote an expansive American empire, military mapmakers applied their knowledge to make war on American colonists. These reflections that I've shared with you today emerged from my work with the Seymour Schwartz collection of North American maps here at the University of Virginia. Schwartz, in his book, The Mapping of America, that he co-authored with Ralph Ehrenberg, used Revolutionary War maps to tell the story of how disconnected colonies became a unified nation. Today, I've asked slightly different questions about maps from this remarkable map collection. How do they reflect new methods for military, topographic, and coastal surveying in war and in peace? How did such maps influence the ways in which map readers imagined distant places? The American Revolution was a battle of ideas defined by notions of liberty, tyranny, slavery, and freedom. But it was also a series of engagements that took place in real geographic space. Warfare in North America opened up these spaces to view throughout the British world. On both sides of the Atlantic, book readers and map viewers watched an imperial world fall apart in high resolution. What I have called the surveyor's eye was a rigorous way of looking and representing geographic space. It zoomed in on sites of conflict and pictured the natural world with startling clarity. Such a view gained enormous authority in the second half of the 18th century. It gave commanders the confidence to dispatch forces to remote places, and it created images in which map viewers immersed themselves as they meditated on the meanings of Britain's global empire as it was convulsed by war. Thank you.
So I think there were profits to be had, certainly. I don't know the details, I don't know statistics on like return on investment for these things. But I think it's more than just money. I mean, if you wanted to produce a book that made money, there are other ways of doing it that were probably less expensive. There was something I think that compelled producers to offer these rare and compelling images, and people certainly demanded them. They didn't want to just hear the stories of these wars, they wanted to see them. They wanted to be invested, engaged, and involved. The best way to do that is through these very high resolution. Yes?
Well, you mentioned photographers coming over during the campaigns, first with the Presidential War and then fourth with the Revolutionary War. Would you consider them first journalists who come to anybody in the country?
Did I consider them journalists?
Themselves.
They were not trained as journalists. They were military surveyors whose first job was to build the forts, lay out the roads, and make the plan. But they understood that their skills gave them an entrepreneurial advantage. They could be the ones that published their story and illustrate it to acclaim. Not only did they make money by selling things they had authored, they used their maps as kind of showpieces to get the attention of senior British officials so they could get appointments. So for instance, Samuel Holland, who mapped Prince Edward Island, became the Surveyor General for General Surveyor of America. He produced an incredible map of occupied Canada that he then took and presented to senior officials and the king. This performance, this beautiful map, earned him his position, which then later led to him being one of the largest landowners in Canada after the American Revolution, a wealthy person. These map makers did not come from wealthy families, they came from humble social rank, and so they saw in their unique skill set a way to really jump to the higher ranks of society.
But some of these, they were commissioned officers in service to the king, but the maps and the details they drew were not considered government property in those days.
I guess they might have been, but Britain made a tactical decision since it didn't have its own cartographic service. And the Spanish and the French were also much more wary about releasing strategic information in published maps, not because the British was so predatory these empires. The British decided that not only did they have the capacity to make them, it was better to just get them all out there. Because those maps, as they circulated to audiences around the world, demonstrated British knowledge, British control, British expansiveness of the British empire. So they wanted them. But they had to ask permission. That permission was almost always granted.
The patronage system of 18th century British society is very foreign to us. It feels like fraud and corruption. But that's the way people lived in this society. Colonial governors had side businesses and monopolies. Everyone had their cut. And so it was seen as a legitimate way of making money and rising money. Good question. Yes?
Thanks.
So
So did they take the mapmakers have apprentices? How did they transfer their skills, the mapping skills?
they did. So Thomas Jeffries, for instance, had a workshop that produced the map. So Diderot's Encyclopedia has, if you go into the Rare Books Library, there's a recreated copperplate press and images from the Encyclopedia that show the methods of what a workshop would involve. And it's a pretty busy hive of activity. So the most common question I get from my students when I show them these beautiful maps is, what do colors mean? Because a lot of them are sold as hand-colored maps. And more often than not, they mean nothing. And the reason they mean nothing is because they were assigned to the 15-year-old beginning apprentice who could do nothing else. And it didn't even matter to people how neat or sloppy they were. They had some color that made them more valuable. And people didn't seem to mind if the watercolor went beyond the lines or anything like that. So from the lowliest apprentice to the most, the most expensive thing on the map is the cartouche. So of the DeGrom map, the one of the slave workers making indigo. That was usually a different engraver from the one who engraved the surface of the map. And it was the highest skilled engraver who could do the beautiful figurative images in the most elegant way. That was among the most expensive. The copper material was expensive. The ink was expensive. The paper was expensive. It was all expensive. And so Thomas Jeffries and others presided over these busy workshops that produced as many copies of these maps as they could to recruit this. Yes?
Yeah, especially some of the early slides had multiple dates for the maps.
Mm-hmm.
And what were they represented? Were they the same plates being used? Were they retouched in some way? Were they updated?
Yeah, so map collectors and scholars call these the different states of the map. So it's the same copper plate, but I've done a study, you can find it at this website here, one particular map that has I think 11 or 12 different states. It's Emmanuel Bowen's New and Accurate Map of North America that goes from, the first edition is in 1755, and it kind of shows the British and the French and their standoff in North America. And then every time there's a new war and a new peace treaty, Bowen went back and poured acid on the stuff he wanted to erase and re-engraved the copper plate and reprinted it. Because everyone wants the new and accurate, right? The most up-to-date information. They're hungry for that new knowledge. And that's the way you keep selling maps, right? You give people a little bit new and improved version. It's capitalism, of which we're very familiar. So these maps would be reprinted in multiple editions, especially as the boundaries and the battles and the interests change. Yes?
Would these maps have also been available in pocket size for troops? I mean, these are
It's funny you mention that, because one of the atlases that was produced during this era by Sayre and Bennett was called the American Military Pocket Atlas. So all these surveyors, like DeGrom and Holland, all the people I told you about, surveyed the new lands that were required in the Civil War. They were synthesized into new, smaller editions that show the map of the northern British colonies, the middle British colonies, the southern British colonies, the West Indies, and a few other places. And they were compiled into this little atlas that some military officers actually had a special leather holster commissioned that would fit it perfectly. You can see how useful this would be to a war that's spread out over a hemisphere and a globe, really. That if you're corresponding with another commander in another theater of the war, you want to have the same maps at hand to make a plan or to understand what's happening. So it's also called the American Military Holster. That's a really great example of these maps that were made for a totally different purpose. They were made for development, economic growth, colonialism, and they were instantly valuable as military documents that could guide troops. So yes, the other place where coarser, smaller maps were produced for mass consumption are the big magazines of the 18th century. Gentleman's Magazine. It's kind of like the New Yorker of its day. It was a magazine of literature, politics, and history, and it included many smaller maps that derived from wall maps with smaller size. So even if you didn't have the 60 days with a cow or the 60 days of labor to buy a big expensive atlas, you might have enough to get an edition of the Journal.
You just mentioned how accuracy and accuracy, the crafting and constructing maps. So there are some areas that British is not over. There is a hate, like going by the traditions. Correct. So how did you depict the mountains, topography, the land in the maps? Did you make them on, or?
Sometimes. I mean, most map makers did not leave the space blank, unless they were real like purists, right? They didn't have any information. People were not made for blank paper. They were made for images that were compelled to that. So, and every early map is like this. It has areas that are well surveyed and researched and very verbally by our students. And some that were essentially copied from other maps, some which were accurate, some which were not accurate. And then they would fill in the blanks. But there were exploratory voyages. So the map of Virginia, Thomas Jefferson's father, Peter Jefferson, was one of the authors. He was one of the leading leaders here in Albemarle County who engaged in fortune and land speculation. Just a few miles from here in Shadwell, where Thomas Jefferson grew up, one of the rooms of the house was devoted to his map-making equipment. Many of the maps that I showed you today were available to Thomas Jefferson as a child, as he learned about the world. And he and his partner, Joshua Fry, did these long expeditions to the Ohio River and beyond. And they turned what happened into a jumble of mountains in the Appalachians to a very coherent set of ridges and valleys. Suddenly you can see these places as real places, not as just imagined places. And these are places that you could occupy yourself and plan for that. So map making is very much a tool of empire. It's a tool of dispossession. And Native Americans, especially in the far west, understood this perfectly, which is why they harassed and sometimes killed surveyors, or at least got them lost, right? Because they understood what that knowledge meant, and not having it kept the far west undeveloped for a long time.
Please join me in thanking Professor Edelson.